Hello everyone, can you hear me? My name is Bannon. I'm the Director of the Centre for Governance and Public Policy at Griffith University. I wanted to warmly welcome you to today's session on Sir Samuel Griffith Symposium on the Australian Federation. The first symposium was held in 2013. And it was supported by the then Premier of Queensland, who was quite keen to start a conversation about the nature of federalism. He felt that this hadn't been addressed with sufficient seriousness. And so the 2013 session was supported both by the Centre of Governance and Public Policy and Federalism as well. At the time, I gave an undertaking that the Centre would hold the next one. And since then, of course, this is the third one, and I think we're going to hold this from now on every year. You're more than welcome to attend the next one in Brisbane, which is going to be quite a big event, AJ tells me. But in any case, I wanted to sincerely thank the organisers of the Abbott conference for allowing these sessions to proceed. So in that spirit, let me invite AJ Brown to introduce our distinguished guest.
And thank you, everybody. Thanks, Hagan. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for being part of what I think is going to be a very significant discussion for many of us this afternoon as we take stock on the state of federal reform in Australia and figure out the next steps for many of us. I think in what's going to be a very interesting time. We've got two sessions lined up for you this afternoon, as you're probably aware. Before I introduce John, I just wanted to map it out for you a little bit. What we're going to do is really have a discussion in this first session about what is the state of the federal reform process. So after John's keynote, we'll be very pleased to be joined by a number of commentators who have been important voices on federal reform amongst the political science community. And part of the purpose of holding the symposium this year as part of the APSA conference was to continue to try and do our bit to have some real-world policy discussion happening in APSA. There's lots of real-world policy discussion happening in all the Australian Political Science Association panels. There's no doubt about that. But we like to really do really hard work on really hard issues. So we really wanted to have a working session where we did discuss the state of play with federal reform and the future of federal reform. So I'm very glad that we'll have a bit of a discussion prompted by Alan Fenner from University, from Amanda Swan from the ANU, from Richard Eccleston from University of Tasmania. And I'm also happy to say that we have here today Rebecca Cross, who's the Deputy Secretary and Head of Domestic Policy in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, overseeing the Federation Reform White Paper process. But also quite a number of you who have been involved in some of our research from other agencies, both federal and state agencies. A very big welcome to you for being part of the process and for also for supporting our research. After afternoon tea, we'll have three papers that are more traditional APSA style presentations of research results that are relevant to Federation reform at the moment. And I just wanted to say as well in kicking off that we wanted to thank the organisers of the APSA conference for this year, but also to thank the Australian Research Council for the funding, which is supporting quite a good deal of our research into federalism at the moment. Much of what you'll hear about today in terms of the Griffith University and collaborators' perspective on federal reform is being funded by this particular project. And so it's great to have our collaborators from University of New South Wales here today, and in spirit from University of Sydney and from the ANU. This Australian Research Council project is funding the Australian Constitutional Values Survey both last year and next year. we'll be, after afternoon tea, we'll be talking about some of the results from that. But also, it's funding what has been a major suite of research activity this year that we've been leading from the centre through this project, which we've called the Future of Australia's Federation Survey, which includes the survey of federal and state agencies, which we've just completed. And again, we'll be presenting some results from that after afternoon tea. But I particularly wanted to mention that survey and also the ongoing surveys of local government nationally and of parliamentarians nationally that we've got underway. Particularly to thank those of you who are here, who have done an enormous amount to assist us with the data collection, which we think is going to be extremely relevant and useful to whatever happens with federal reform processes from here on in. So we'll explain and introduce that data later, but I wanted to say right from the outset, welcome to those of you who have been involved at an agency level in helping this research take the shape that it has and be as successful as we think it is shaping up to be. So on that note, my greatest privilege of the day is to introduce our keynote speaker for the day. And in some ways this is a reunion for some of us, because some of you will be aware of a conference that we held in Tenterfield, New South Wales in 2008, which where one of our special guests was indeed the very same John Bannon, along with many other good people laying the groundwork for what's been some ongoing research and policy discussion and debate ever since then. In fact, it was at Tenterfield in 2008 that I do believe that Tony Abbott, over at a dinner speech, first floated publicly the contents of what he was about to publish in his book Battle Lines. And we'll be talking about this, I suspect, in the course of the next couple of hours. But it was a pretty fascinating place and a pretty fascinating moment to be thinking about federal reform prospects. And as it turned out, that was a pretty pivotal discussion to be having. Of course, time has moved on since then in so many ways, and so that's why we're so privileged to have John here, as well as many of you, to discuss what is the state of the federal reform process here in Australia. John needs very little introduction. He's an elder statesman of Australian politics in so many ways. He represents what we all absolutely know for sure is the most socially enlightened state of the Commonwealth. It has been for a long time. In many ways it remains today. We can all celebrate this fact as part of celebrating the richness of Australian federalism. And that's due in no small part to John's service as Premier and Treasurer of South Australia from 1982 to 1992. Of course, that's within a much longer period of political service. As you all know, he was President of the Australian Labor Party for a similar period, or a substantial period, and he served in many other distinguished roles as well, including on the ABC board. But his current role has been very significant and very important, because, as you would all be aware, with the current federation reform process, well, we hope that it's still a current process. With the federation reform process that's been underway in the last couple of years, the Prime Minister appointed an expert advisory panel of 6 distinguished Australians, and I think many of us would agree that the single most distinguished Australian on that group of 6, no offence to your colleagues on that expert advisory panel, but the single most distinguished Australian on that group is Dr. John Bannon. So without any further ado, I'll ask John Bannon to tell us how and why we're going to keep federation reform alive. Please join me.
Well, thanks for that generous introduction, AJ. And ladies and gentlemen, it's certainly a pleasure to be able to spruik to an informed gathering like this. And one of the things that the expert advisory panel, so-called expert advisory panel, is one of our jobs is to get around and talk about the process. So I'll certainly be doing that, particularly in the light of some changes that may be taking place, and also just try and spread the word amongst those who are interested, involved, could influence, etc. So I enjoy being on the platform. In fact, I'm sort of surrounded by Sir Samuel Griffith. He's just disappeared from the screen, because only a short few weeks ago I was addressing the Samuel Griffith Society conference. I know that there is no connection between the society and its university, or indeed this symposium, but of course a lot of what I say here was relevant to that and will be relevant today. So any of you who are privileged enough to be there at that gathering, you will have heard some of this before, but obviously I've needed to upgrade, and events are fast moving. I do recall the 2008 Tenterfield occasion very well. There was some interesting papers, great company, and you know, some of us helped debunk Parkes a bit, I think, you know, from the father of Federation coinage that he enjoys. A fascinating man, Sir Henry. But yes, former Prime Minister Abbott was there. He was the keynote, he was the dinner speaker, and we had a lively exchange. So when he invited me to be a member of this panel and was outlining the concept of the white paper, the Federation process, I said, look, I have to be frank with you, Prime Minister. You know, he did recall the Tenterfield occasion because he forgot I was an old Polly, so he tried to take the mickey out of me at one point, and unfortunately it rebounded on him. And in fact, I'm not talking out of school, and he said to me afterwards, he said, "Oh, that was a bloody stupid thing to do. Of course you could have, you can respond to it, you know." But we had a lively exchange over federal state powers, and I'm an unashamed federalist and always have been, which is not to say I'm not respectful of or believe in the lead role of the Commonwealth government in so many areas. But having said that, I'd read his essay in Battle Lines and so on. I said, I can't see much point or much advice I can give, because really, you know, the line that you seem to have is one that just wouldn't work in this context, in my view. He said, no, he said, I've changed, I've revised my thinking. He didn't actually say I've become Prime Minister now, so I realise I have to do something about it. But he convinced me that he'd stepped back from where he was in 2008 and had another look at it, and like any smart person, had modified his views to the extent that he better understood the way in which the Federation worked, and indeed the role of the states in that Federation. And that was part of the birth, if you like, of this particular exercise. Let's just begin with a kind of a little historical background, which you're familiar, but it's worth putting into the context of this current exercise. As we know, since 1901, there have been constantly changing relationships between the former self-governing colonies and the federation they created. There was no question that the parties, the delegates, elected directly, albeit not appointed by their parliaments, as the 1891 convention at which Sir Samuel had such a major role, albeit elected, which was an astonishing exercise in democracy in itself, believed that what they were doing was creating a level of government that could pick up those things that were better handled nationally, but as far as life for the states were concerned, the colonies turned into states, it would chug on pretty much as usual. They define the role of the federal government, they'd spell out its heads of power, they'd create a court to interpret disputes that may arise over that, and the Privy Council, therefore, and this was the big argument, you know, only had a sort of minimal impact in some areas. And this minimalist concept of federation was very much in the minds of the delegates. To them, the states were conferring some of their powers on a national entity, but reserving everything else for themselves. Now, as we know, over the course of the century, hastened by rulings of the High Court, by judges incidentally solely appointed by the Commonwealth Government, not the states or the parliaments, by the need to manage great national events like the two World Wars and the Depression, Commonwealth power invariably increased. Crises saw the Commonwealth take more of the revenue-raising powers into its hand. After the crisis was over, they tended not to be returned. It's been a kind of ratchet effect through the period since Federation. And the Commonwealth power to make special grants to the states, a constitutionally embodied power, was increasingly used. And in fact, special purpose payments became a substantial source of revenue to fund state programs, but under terms and conditions laid down by the Commonwealth. So in revenue raising, even in programs and activities outside what was envisaged as the brief of the Commonwealth Government, increasingly the Commonwealth was entwined with the system. Increasing vertical fiscal imbalance put more constraints on state autonomy, less ability to raise their own funds, and the High Court in some of its rulings hasn't helped with that at all. So we've got the special purpose payments, the reliance on the Grants Commission to fairly distribute the general allocation from the Commonwealth, and tensions and difficulty inevitably emerged from that. I came to this, on a personal note, I became involved with federal-state relations at the time of the Whitlam government. When the Commonwealth government seized the whole agenda, there was nothing Gough could or didn't want to do, particularly in relation to some of the things the states had been recalcitrant on, in his view, for so long. And he attempted to bypass recalcitrant states with very mixed results. It wasn't a happy experience. Some major changes were made, some major institutions were created, but there were a lot of mistakes along the way. And one of the biggest mistakes, one of the reasons I believe strongly that the Whitlam government didn't succeed was that there was no respect whatsoever for the states and their power. A bit understandable when you've got people like Belge-Peterson and Askin and others sniping at you, Henry Bolte, but nonetheless, it was Gough's crash or crash through approach that didn't advance federal-state relations at all, and in fact meant that some of the big initiatives that could have been done cooperatively were unwound. Well, I came in at the end of this process. Malcolm Fraser had tried to restore some sort of responsibility of state relations, but like many, particularly a conservative leader, he'd promised big, and once he got into the hands of, once the levers of power were in the hands of him and his ministers, he became far more centralist and less open to these things, and we've seen that happen periodically through the period since then. Nonetheless, the process went on, and during that period, Fraser, Hawke and Keating, all of which I was in office, we had numerous premiers' conferences, loan councils, ministerial meetings, national summits, think of the wages, prices freeze, of Fraser, the price income summit, the tax summit, the employment initiatives and so on. But at bottom, the system hadn't changed very much at all. Even the creation of a particular instrument like the Economic Planning Advisory Council by the Hawke government didn't really change a basic system that had developed into an annual Premiers' Conference and Loan Council, where the Commonwealth would develop a take it or leave it offer for the states, where the states would head off to Canberra promising to do this, that and the other, usually domestically focused. And in fact there was no real time in the conference to discuss it. Nobody else was interested in it, but nonetheless you had to sort of conjure something up out of this to respond to your domestic market. But in terms of the financial offer, it kept getting later and later till, finally we were in a position where we'd be sitting in our hotel rooms, the Premier surrounded with his Treasury advisors and others, waiting for the sound of footsteps and the rustle under the door as the offer was placed in the room, and we'd all spring on it with alacrity and search through and try and find. The meeting would be commencing in about 2 or 3 hours' time after this, and then we'd all the premiers would be on the phone to the Prime Minister asking when they could see him privately, just quickly before the meeting, just to raise a couple of points. So these bilateral little gatherings, one Premier would be shuffled out the back door and the other one shuffled in the front door, while Bob Hawke sort of sat there presiding. It was, a complete botch of a process, if you like. And it had really reached a point by the late 80s where a chaotic procedure that had sort of managed to work finally broke down. And in this context, some of you might have heard this before, but I always like, because I think it sets the scene quite nicely, to quote this report. This is the conference, Premiers' Conference of 1990. It involved me very centrally. The headline says, "Treasurer miffed by Premier's dual role." The Treasurer concerned is Paul Keating, the Premier was me. John Bannon's dual role as South Australian Premier and National ALP President sparked an angry clash with the Treasurer, Mr Keating, at the Premiers' Conference yesterday. It's believed Mr Keating was annoyed by that's an understatement, by Mr Bannon's leading role in the Premier's revolt on Thursday, because we all jacked up over this process, and saw Mr Bannon's action as being politically damaging to the Labor Party. Yesterday, Mr Bannon said his position as President had been irrelevant to the negotiations over funding, but perhaps it's had some bearing on the attitude of my federal colleagues. I suspect they were somewhat miffed by the fact I took a leading part in the move by the Premiers. I was simply acting as a Premier trying to protect the interests of the state. Other sources said somewhat miffed was an understatement, but Mr Keating laughed the matter off. Mr Bannon misbehaved, but we can forgive him for that, Mr Keating said. This is about scraping as much off my plate onto theirs as they can. The entire conference was reportedly marked by a series of fiery exchanges. It's believed the Prime Minister, Mr Hawke, greeted state and territory leaders yesterday by saying the Commonwealth offer was going to stay the same, so you might as well bugger off. It's true. When the Victorian Premier, Mr Cain, submitted the state's counter-offer, Mr Hawke apparently dismissed it as chicken shit. Later, Mr Hawke said the conference had been a pleasant and ultimately constructive experience. The New South Wales Premier, Mr Greiner, said Mr Hawke had used a number of words I wouldn't dare to use in this press conference. Well, unlike most news reports, that's pretty accurate. But really, what it indicated was the urgent need, the necessity to change this. And thankfully out of it came a series of special Premiers' conferences, which Bob Hawke took a lead in convening. It led by 1992 to the creation of the Council of Australian Governments. and procedures that are with us today. And however flawed they may be, they're a hell of a lot better than they were in the period that I'm describing. Ironically, incidentally, that process helped bring Prime Minister Hawke down in 1991, because Prime Minister his former Treasurer, who'd retired to the back bench and challenged him from there, sounds familiar, doesn't it, effectively used the allegation in the Labor caucus that Bob Hawke was surrendering control of the economy to the states. Paul himself became something of a convert, remember the One Nation and various other things, to the idea that you actually had to work with the states if you were going to get something done. So sometimes successful, sometimes neglected, revived. It's fair to say a lot of improvements have taken place post-COAG, but there's still a basic dysfunction. There's overlaps, duplication, buck passing of responsibility, political competition between levels of government, and from time to time they can produce breakdown. States found they carry responsibility to deliver services but don't have the means to do so, and that's particularly acute at the moment. A lack of respect and trust between the three tiers of government doesn't help. Well, a year ago, a bit more than a year, Prime Minister Abbott announced the start of this process of the reform of federation, which again attempts to overcome the problems. The government, he announced, would initiate a process of reform that would attempt to render, or if appropriate, eliminate overlap between the states and Commonwealth responsibility. And he suggested a very open agenda. A reform of federation white paper would be produced using a collaborative process, and I'd stress that. It would be prepared in conjunction with a paper on taxation and financial reform. The terms of reference specified that where possible, clean lines of responsibility should be drawn. Increasingly, as we've gone through the exercise, the easy concept of clean lines, look, the states will do that, the Commonwealth will get out of it, or vice versa, have become blurred because they're necessarily blurred by the structure of a federation. But it was hoped that we wouldn't just be involved in the normal obscure and tiresome wrangle between levels of government. And the focus would be, and this is a critical thing because it's so often forgotten, on the outcomes for clients of government, not on the bureaucratic process or political process that led there. Actually look at what the citizen's getting and how effective it is. Now, I'd suggest there are a number of refreshing elements in this, and I think this has given this process a momentum that has surprised people if they've looked closely at the way it's gone over that more than 12 months. Firstly, Prime Minister Abbott indicated an openness to reallocation of functions. As he said in the terms of reference, the Commonwealth has become, for various reasons, increasingly involved in matters that have been traditionally of the states. The states have become increasingly reliant on revenue collected by the Commonwealth to deliver services in areas they're responsible for. The question of whether it was for the Commonwealth to relinquish direct involvement in some programs or take them over fully or other options would all be on the table. That's the refreshing bit. They'd all be on the table for consideration. Secondly, he acknowledged that consensus was necessary for any major reforms to be implemented. COAG would be central to the process. There was a structure there already. A steering committee was established comprising heads of premiers and chief ministers' departments. So central agencies at the highest level, which meant it didn't get bogged down in the ministerial councils or subgroups or whatever. And incidentally, local government was involved as well on the steering group through the CEO, and have been involved through their president with the various conferences that have taken place. Thirdly, the issues would be treated separately. Financial issues would be treated separately, to a large extent. It's allowed a more uncluttered and in-principled exercise to take place with federation reform proposals, which can be examined for their own intrinsic value rather than getting immediately caught up with the familiar where's the money coming from question. That's a question that usually stops policy discussion in its tracks, and heads it down the tax argument, and means that it's hard to get an objective feeling. The concept of this exercise is, let's see what we can construct that are the best options, then we'll have a look at where we'll get this money from, because it will need money, but it'll also involve, I suggest, and can involve, money that's already in the system, that needs reallocation, that is being wasted and spent on the wrong programs without measurable outcomes. That doesn't mean, of course, that you can divorce any discussion from revenue and other issues. You can't. The media wouldn't let you anyway, because that's the only thing they seem to be able to understand. They're not interested very much in the other aspects of it. And so there is this parallel exercise of a taxation and finance study and its own white paper. And the two exercises under this schema, if it continues, will be brought together as an active as an active plan where one can answer the questions: how should we be doing this and delivering this, and how are we going to pay for it? He also established this expert advisory panel, of which I'm a member, to provide an independent assessment of papers produced by the Secretariat, to provide ideas, to speak at gatherings like this, to work as a commentator, if you like, on the Green Paper. I'm a member, together with Professor Greg Craven, a well-known constitutional lawyer and Vice-Chancellor of the Catholic University, Professor Doug McTaggart, who's both in academia and in the highest of public service positions in a number of states and jurisdictions, has had a lot of experience in this area. Jennifer Westacott, who is the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia, and a constructive and creative thinker who's also got a background in major public service department leadership. Cheryl Edwards from Western Australia, who's both had political experience and is involved in a number of the issues that concern the White Paper. And Alan Stockdale, the former Treasurer of Victoria and President of the Liberal Party. I guess he's my sort of counterweight. I'm the tame Labor man on. I don't know how tame Alan is, but he's both of us have been probably more centrally involved in a political sense than the others. We've been involved in federal state issues as practitioners and commentators, some ministers, senior public servants, consultants, etc. And it covers private sector. So it's a broad group, it's an interesting group, it's reacting and working together well. And we've undertaken, and the Secretariat has led community round table discussions in all states and territories. Issues papers were released over a period of time, starting from about 12 months ago and going through to February, March. Topics that were seen as the ones where most useful work could be done in a most progressive way were selected by the various parties, including the states and territories. So we're looking at health, at education, training from preschool to universities, vocational employment training, and housing and homelessness as keys. I'll come back to them in a second. Following one of the key things that's happened is the Leaders' Retreat, which, much to a lot of people's surprise, firstly happened after it was proposed by Prime Minister Abbott, but secondly was extremely successful and productive in terms of the interaction between the leaders of the governments of our country. Members of the EAP, Expert Advisory Panel, who were privileged to make presentations at it, and we were the only other ones apart from the leaders involved. Advisors and others were, if you like, sidelined so that the discussion could be held in that context. Came out shaking our heads. We'd been to many a federal gathering of all sorts over the years, and we'd never seen anything like it in terms of productive, intelligent discussion and interchange. I'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, the states have divided up topics among themselves for more intensive review, and Indigenous Affairs, incidentally, has been added to the existing policy. So you've got, for instance, take early childhood learning. South Australia and the Northern Territory and local government are focusing on that to do some intensive work. Queensland and the ACT are looking at school education. Western Australia and Victoria are looking at training. Vic and Tasmania are looking at health. New South Wales and Queensland are focusing particularly on housing and some revenue issues. Western Australia and Northern Territory are looking at the Indigenous stuff, and the Commonwealth is exploring in depth the governance issues. So, if you like, there's these subgroupings, and the states have put up their hands and said, yes, we're interested particularly in this area, so we're going to do some more intensive work, which we will bring back to the table when ready. Okay, I guess the question then is, really in a sense, the question I was asking Prime Minister Abbott originally, you know, is this really an open exercise that is going to lead somewhere, or is it just, you know, a bit of window dressing because people sort of know what the outcome will be, which will be pretty negative. So is the effort to be worthwhile? Well, a threshold question, I certainly believe that Prime Minister Abbott increasingly became committed to this exercise. Now, whether he could carry that either within his own caucus, which has to be done in some way or another eventually, or in the country at large, who knows? You know, he was operating under all those other political pressures and difficulties throughout this time, but he did keep this exercise rolling, and he kept focused on it throughout that period. Now, of course, we're in new territory with Prime Minister Turnbull, and you know, it'd be great to flourish some sort of announcement that it is going ahead, or it is being modified in some ways, or whatever. That question can't be answered at the moment. The new Prime Minister, sensibly enough, has not actually been able to focus on this, but is in the process of doing so. So within the next, well, very short time, I'm told, both by those that are working with him and his assistant ministers, and the feeling within the Secretariat of the Commonwealth and the gossip around the place is that, yes, this exercise will continue. There's been such a build-up, there's been such a lot of expert and committed work. The states and territories are committed at the moment. They're all on side to varying degrees, but they're all on side. It would be sensible for the new Prime Minister to take the matter up. Now, whether he'll change the emphasis of it or whatever, we don't know. So unfortunately, I can't give you a sneak preview or insight into it. But all I can say is that the auguries look quite good, that it's not just going to be ditched and we'll start afresh. Interestingly, in today's Australian, you'll find an article where Sarah Martin, the reporter, has actually done the rounds to try and find out what's happening. I was one of the people she spoke to, and I get a sentence in that article from probably a 20-minute interview or something. But Premier Jay Weatherall from South Australia, we know, has been very strong on this whole exercise, and there's no doubt Mike Baird from New South Wales has been providing tremendous impetus as well. But she quotes Colin Barnett, who was a very unhappy man earlier in the year, but he's changed his attitudes a bit. Now, while Premier Barnett said, I think the most important issue is solving this HFE, the fair share of the collection of GST. Nonetheless, I see the value of these other issues, and he certainly does, because he and his government are fully embracing this process. And the one or two other comments that she's managed to glean all suggest that there is going to be a pushback from the premiers and leaders if the new Prime Minister says, well, this is a waste of time, or we're not going to bother with it anymore. So I find that quite encouraging. There's certainly arguments that can be mounted for and against the process. I have to confess to finding a depressing level of cynicism about the whole exercise, with low expectations that anything can be achieved, a kind of here we go again common refrain among the media, many of the media who love talking about tax but don't understand the other things. The negativity of academics in particular, the failure of the media to grasp the concepts and look at it has been very disappointing, I think. But you could say, well, a lot of us have been round the track before. So, and the negative arguments are easy to make. If the changes are to be fundamental, surely we have to change the Constitution, and the electorate just doesn't want to do that. The Constitution is valued, is hard to change, and so it should be, in my view. But in fact, so that's one argument. Different requirements and priorities of the stakeholders. There's no sort of uniform view. The lack of respect and trust that governments have between them. And also, of course, within government departments with a vested interest in survival. They don't want to be abolished or amalgamated or whatever if they can avoid it. The political volatility, uncertainty of tenure of leaders and or governments, which must undermine commitments. This particularly impacts on the durability of agreements, and that's one of the messages that keeps coming through. Sure, we can make agreements, but they don't last. The policy changes, the government changes, the funding runs out, the pilot scheme is not taken up. Why would we bother? That does a lot of harm, and I think a lot of harm has been done over the last few years by the introduction or announcement of things which are labelled reform, for instance, or even, goodness me, revolution, the education revolution. I mean, programs that end up being aborted or terminated or adjusted. And finally, a lack of bipartisanship. It's been a very febrile, oppositionist decade, really, which is not conducive normally to these sorts of reforms. So I've just made a very good case for the academics I've just criticised for being so negative. The fact is, I think there are strong counters to these arguments. For a start, right at the beginning or early on was ruled out changing the Constitution. You don't need to make some very good changes in the process of distribution of powers and the various things that need to be addressed. They're not necessary. They're neat, they're tidy, they could help, but they come at the lower end of the scale. You can have a quite radical reordering of powers and responsibilities without the need for constitutional change. So we're not considering that. The issues are common to all jurisdictions. Certainly one size can't fit all, but the white paper will be able to account for some of those specifics within a national context. And bilateral pilot programs can indeed be undertaken. That's one of the strengths of federation. thirdly, the close involvement of premiers and chief ministers and their officers and their departments have already dispelled a lot of suspicion. Everyone, to some extent, has a vested interest in reforms, both functional and fiscal, at the moment. Fourthly, we're currently in what I'd call an election-free zone. Well, comparatively, it's never entirely free in Australia. Most governments can focus on issues well into next year without distraction. Even the instability, in inverted commas, at the federal level, I think the new Prime Minister has said, well, I expect to serve out my term. I hope he does, because I think there is no reason not to. And indeed, if he's going to make an impact and set himself up for re-election, that's what he should be doing, instead of opportunistically trying to run the polls. And so it is with other governments. The federal government and Western Australian governments go to the polls next year, but others are either halfway through or at the beginning of terms. And I think this creates an opportunity, a window of opportunity, yes, but a window that will rapidly close. I mean, we can't sit around on this. There is a momentum. The Premier's retreat, I think, was a very good example of the way in which that momentum can work and what has followed it. But problems can strike anywhere, anytime in politics, so the occasion has to be grasped as quickly as possible. I'd suggest we've probably got a 6 to 9 month window in which we could make some serious change. And that really leads into the fifth factor I'd suggest, which is favouring a sustainable consensus. State and territory governments are evenly divided between the two major parties, the big, the small, the territories. There's Labor, Liberal. The attitude and response of the federal opposition, of course, is important. It hasn't yet been tested. It's probably too easy. They'll reasonably wait until they have more detailed information. But I really hope that the Labor government leaders in Victoria, Queensland and South Australia and the ACT will be able to provide an assurance to their federal colleagues of the integrity of the process. Well, why do we have to take action now? How am I going for time? Yes, okay. I did want to show you some slides, which I'll do now. I'll just press the button. Okay. There's been all sorts of material produced, and some of this is in the public domain. It's all available in the public domain because it's been cleared through our Secretariat. But just to do a little bit of scene setting. Here's a slide on the reform of the Federation White Paper, and you can see the fiscal pressures affecting the balance sheets of governments. The days of reducing debt easily and taking a bit of fiscal pressure off governments are over, and we've seen, here's the trend lines, which are up and up and up. I mean, the states are sort of keeping under control, but they're well above the zero. These are the heady days when governments, had a bit of money. Colin Barnett was complaining furiously about the GST, and somebody pointed out, well, it's over a 5-year averaging. You were doing very well indeed when the state was booming. And Barnett said, well, yes, but that wasn't so easy. And the others said to him, but Colin, you spent the money. You spent the money then. You should have been keeping it for here when you knew. Anyway, these sort of arguments will go on interminably. But everyone's in the same boat, and it's not a good boat to be in. We need to make some changes. What else can be done to ensure we have a more efficient tax system? Well, this useful pie chart shows you just what sort of constraints there are on the state and territory governments. Look at the sort of taxes they have to rely on, bearing in mind that some of the so-called excise, but the taxes that had been traditionally levied on various products, the High Court has ruled go beyond the powers of the state. Controversial, could be revisited, maybe be successful, but big chunks of their revenue-raising ability were wiped out, and here we are reliant on, payroll tax, employment negative, if you like, gambling, which no one feels terribly comfortable about, but is sort of necessary. This is an area that could well be looked at, but again, it's think of the fate of Commonwealth estate duties. Once one state, Queensland in this case, got rid of them, then the pressure goes on and it becomes lowest common denominator stuff. So there are real constraints on the states to get their fiscal act together. Now you say, but they've got the GST, which gives them an assured share. The Commonwealth raises that on behalf of the states. But this is pretty stark, isn't it? If you haven't seen this before. Here's the annual growth rate of the last 10 years of GST, here of income tax, and here of non-GST transfers. So it hasn't been the growth tax that was expected to solve the problems. And the distribution, of course, there's the issue that Mr. Barnett rightly complains about. Although, take this graph back further and you'd find Western Australia sitting above it. But this, I think the Grants Commission does a very good job indeed, but these inequities will continue. I mentioned the focus on the various areas, so I needn't go through that again. And now let's look at some specifics. Preschool is delivered differently in different jurisdictions, and you've got an immediate funding anomaly. If it's childcare, then the Commonwealth has a responsibility. If it's preschool, kindergarten type facilities, the state has the responsibility of funding. So if you're at a kindergarten, fine, or if you're at a childcare centre, okay. But what if you're combining the two? What if you're delivering your preschool through preschool and after-hours childcare through schools? What if you are a private provider, for instance, of all-day childcare, but you're introducing a component of education and preschool? Who's funding what and how and why? This is the real issue, and as you can see, the pattern state by state is very different. Now you mightn't change those patterns fundamentally, but you can address the funding issues that flow from it. Around 40% of preschool attendance occurs in long day care with the greatest level of integration. Well, those states want to see more of the education element. The next two slides I think are very stark. This is where I say that there's money in the system available. There's money which is being used in the wrong way. Look at the increase in funding to schools over that period of time, and look at the declining outcomes that we've seen. What's it been spent on? Well, a lot has been spent on reducing class sizes, very popular with teachers and students, but its educational value, around the 1s and 2s and 3s of average class size they're doing, is completely unproven. It may even be negative in some cases. Sure, you can increase the teaching workforce, but all the evidence points to the fact that it is the quality of the teaching, the training and the expertise of the teacher that is significant, not whether they can stand up in front of the class and try and keep order. Okay, and then you go to this next one. The expenditure, which as I say, has been absolutely significant. It's been a real priority. You look at this. in the course of that expenditure over that time, we've actually seen higher performers reduce from 18 to 12, from 18 to 12, and 12 to 14, and lower performing students increase as well. In other words, in these areas, reading and maths to single out, the more we spend, the worse the outcomes have become. Now what's happening? Something wrong is occurring with our expenditure. All governments spend a lot on health, massive amount, and again, how and where that's funded is going to have to be adjusted. Here's the housing and homelessness graph. Interesting that here, if you are under Commonwealth rent relief assistance, then that is, as it says, the Commonwealth will provide the money. But if you're in public housing, it's a state responsibility. And yet the two are integrated: community housing, public housing, and housing assistance. And again, there's confusion about what you're entitled to and who should be paying for it, and whether in fact we're just funding two streams of unconnected homeless or housing issues. And the same with the VET, where expenditure has gone right down. That's on the vocational education training. I think the figure there is that there's been a real increase, obviously, in school education, very significant, in higher education, and VET has gone down quite considerably in terms of its expenditure, and sharply since 11-12. Well, these are the people we're relying on to do the job. This is the famous leaders retreat, and I said I'd come back to it because, as I say, what was most refreshing is that in an environment unencumbered by the media and too much alternative advice and so on, where they were actually interfacing with each other, and they'd been having dinners and lunches and so on, a kind of consensus and collegiality had developed, the like of which I hadn't seen since a brief period in the 1990s, post the breakdown I was talking about. So that's the local government president there, incidentally, Adam, Giles, Palaszczuk, Barnett, Wetherell. Abbott's flanked by Wetherell and Baird, who've been the two most prominent in support of this project. Daniels, Tasmania and the ACT. This is an interesting group that, unfortunately, the central figure has been removed from, unfortunately in some ways, but in another, if the central figure can emerge from the veranda in the form of Malcolm Turnbull and be part of this collegiality, then I'd be very optimistic about the outcome. I won't prolong the discussion. I was just going to quickly adumbrate to you the rules that are going down. What the rules governing this reform? Number one, political feasibility, the consensus and involvement of everyone. A focus on results, what the citizen is getting, not just a bureaucratic fix-up. Thirdly, the Commonwealth having a leadership role. This has been seen as critical from our workshops and everywhere else, and I suspect AJ Brown's surveys will begin to flesh some of that out. Greater autonomy for the states, to give them a bit of breathing space and not allow them to be played off against each other in the same way. Durable and sustainable projects accordingly. Fifthly, the national interest. This is bruited around as a thing that justifies just about anything, but unfortunately it's used in the context the national interest is what the Commonwealth Government deems. The national interest, in my view, and increasingly through this exercise, is an interest shared by all levels of government and not just the prerogative of one level. Sixthly, the coordination planning, local planning, which can take place far more effectively. Seventhly, a vital ingredient is reliable data for accountability. It's amazing how still we're collecting differently based statistics on supposedly the same topic. There's got to be some kind of apples and apples approach to decent data, and that's one of the key things I think that will come out of this white paper, whatever else does. And finally, align incentives to outcomes, not to delivery, but for improvement. Thank you.